welcome everyone to this very interesting talk that we are very fortunate to organize for all of you. And Dr. Malavika, Kasturi, I welcome you warmly. I know it's very early in the morning for you in Canada, but on behalf of, we have a new chairman, Mr. Cyrus Gazda. So on behalf of our chairman, our trustees, the Director General of the museum, Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, the staff of the museum, my executive committee, members of the Museum Society, several guests who have joined us this evening, and myself, thank you so much for agreeing to give us this lecture. It's quite an intriguing lecture, ladies and gentlemen, and I will start without too much chatter, but I need to tell you something because it's a very unusual research topic and the approach to this is extremely, extremely interesting. Subject, of course, is Banaras, which is largely perceived and understood as a Hindu sacred space, definitely par excellence, and those who have visited Banaras, I'm sure will agree with me. Dr. Kasturi's presentation seeks to highlight the city's cosmopolitan past and present through a discussion of its Mughal political pensioners who have lived in the city since the 18th century. In the 1780s, Shahzada Jahandar Shah, also known as Jawab Bakht, the eldest son of Shah Alam II, and his deputy, was swept along by the vicissitudes of fortune as his father became the political tool of the Marathas, amongst others. In 1784, Jahandar Shah sought temporary shelter with his household retainers and army in Nawabi Lucknow and then in British territory, namely Banaras, where he died in 1788. His descendants have lived in the city ever since. And this talk will discuss how the later Mughal families have shaped the city's past and present and built its current landscape, including Badshah Bagh, in ways that are now truly marginalized. Dr. Kasturi will also discuss how these Mughal pensioners became part of the warp and weft of Banarasi political, social, and religious life. I'm not going to say anything more, but it's a great topic. And Dr. Kasturi, I'm sure it's taken you years of research and then subsequent publication. So I thank you very, very much. Dr. Kasturi is an associate professor of history at the University of Toronto. It's the crack of dawn over there. And my sincere thanks to you for obliging us with this, adjusting to our timing in India. Her first book, Embattled Identities, Rajput Lineages and the Colonial State in 19th Century North India, was published by OUP, Oxford University Press, in 2002. And she examined the reconfiguration of caste and masculinity through the prism of families and households. Currently, she's working on 2 research projects. She's working on a book manuscript on the history of monasticism, religion, and politics in colonial and post-colonial India. And this research sparked the questions driving her current project on the urban history of Banaras, viewed and analyzed through the eyes of political pensioners who have made this really, I think it's the oldest city, over 1,000 years old. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Kasturi. They've made this city their home. So without much ado, I would just like to thank you once more on behalf of all of us attending and those of us who will be seeing this later on YouTube. Jason, keep the entries open. I can see people still coming in. And I'd like to thank the interns and Jason Johns for all the help that they give us in running these programs on Zoom. So thank you, Hirdaya, and who else is there with us? Yashraj today. Thank you for assisting us through this. And now I hand you over to the technical team to take this evening forward. Thank you. Welcome, Dr. Kasturi, and welcome all those who are attending with us this evening. Enjoy.
Thank you, everyone. for inviting me to present this talk and give me an opportunity to actually discuss with this really interesting audience my findings of a research project that, in fact, is from my larger research on the history of Banaras, as told through the eyes of its Mughal pensioners. The project is tentatively called The Lost Mughal Pensioners of Banaras, Historical Memory, Migration and Public Space in Banaras, from the 18th century to the present. And this project emerged from my previous research, which I'm currently writing, a large part of which takes place in Banaras, which really focuses on the monastic institutions in the city and their relationship with politics, and in the 19th and 20th century. And as I did that, it became very clear to me that this is not a city or space which can be reduced either to Hindu sacred space. It was very clear to me that there was no such thing as a homogeneous Hindu sacred space. In fact, it is very fraught and very fractured. And secondly, it is a pilgrimage city, but in fact, it is much, much more than that. And as a historian who works on the modern period, I would say that, it is as old as all urban settlements go. But of course, it has a certain there is a certain luster that is attached to Banaras because of its so-called timeless past, which is something actually that historians have questioned and have tried to, and I'm part of a group of excellent historians and scholars who in fact have been trying to to rework and rethink the history of Banaras, and also look at it as an urban city and as urban historians. And so that is one of the things that I am trying to do. And this project itself, and my own decision to start doing that happened when I went to Badshah Bagh, the photo of which you are seeing on your screen. And I first went to Badshah Bagh in 2010, and this particular picture is from 2023. So this is a site that I have made repeated visits to. My own research is based not just on archival research, but it's also based on ethnographic fieldwork and a lot of site visits. So all the photographs that you're going to see, with few exceptions, they're all mine, and part of a photo and visual archive that is also very much part of this project. So when I actually went to Badshah Bagh, and I found it very, very interesting, because I had been told that it was a space and site worth seeing in Banaras and off the beaten track. But nobody who actually was from around the area, which is near Sekrol or the cantonment, was able to tell me exactly who was buried in Badshah Bagh, except to tell me that it was a qabristan or a graveyard, and that a Mughal prince who had come here long ago was buried there. And beyond that, in fact, there was very little information. And the space that you see it was already in 2010 bearing the impress of other forms of urban fabric, the sort of the signs of booming real estate, and what we might call, quote unquote, the encroachment of built spaces and pakka houses in the midst of what you can actually see here in this site is not just one maqbara or tomb, but many. And later on, I discovered that Badshah Bagh was not just a qabristan or a graveyard, but is in fact a very complex spatial node and complex and space, which comprised not just the Maqbara of Jahandar Shah, which you see in front of you, which is the large building with the pavilion, and he is actually interred beneath. But in addition to the graves of his descendants, some of which still remain, which you can see in the ornate pavilions, it also comprised pleasure gardens, a baradari, a lake, orchards, and covered over 20 acres. Until 1947. So what I was actually seeing and what I am attempting to chronicle was actually something that was a very big and large part of Banaras's, one of its sites and spaces. And it was extraordinarily well known, and not just that, it also sort of finds mention in municipal records, in a variety of different maps and so on. So when I walked inside, I actually was confronted immediately with a whole set of questions that essentially sort of came up. I had been told that the maqbara that you see to the left of the photograph, which is actually, to the right of the photograph, was that of Jahandar Shah, who was the crown prince and the Shahzada and the eldest son of Shah Alam in the 18th century. And many have mistakenly thought that was his maqbara, but it actually is this taller building, it's elevated structure, and he is buried underneath. But all these issues for me were very, very interesting because I was confronted, as I said, by invisibilized histories, and also faced with a site that I have since revisited many times, that in fact has been completely marginalized, and the families of these pensioners, like other pensioners in Banaras, has actually been given short shrift. And these questions speak to me in my project, which had just then, when I was starting in 2010, I started and went back to actual research on it from 2015, 2016. This is something that made me think about space, historical memories, questions of conservation and curation, right? And spaces that we choose to remember and those that we choose to forget, particularly in Banaras and particularly with regard to the Mughals. And this particular photograph, in a way, I thought I would start my talk with, because it is one that I took recently on my long ethnographic and archival trips in Banaras, and which is almost a metaphor for all the things that I want to talk about, right? And it is for that of lost histories, of possibilities of what was, and what has been erased of the colonial, in fact, also of the post-colonial past, because this also was a site that was sort of, in a sense, managed by the government of Uttar Pradesh till 1973, after which it sort of fell off the face of, at least, government management, and it's not listed as a monument in any of the lists, colonial or post-colonial, of the sites that are under sort of government care in Banaras. So this photograph also points, as my larger project seems to think about, the erasure of history and the precarious nature of physical fabric as well, and the selective memories of the Mughals, which in the public space have largely been, shall we say, much more polarizing, and has focused on the Mughals in the early modern period, and not on the later Mughals at all. So my entire project has shifted, and now actually it looks at the urban history of Banaras through the eyes of the family, of the pensioner families. Now, the Mughals were not the only pensioner families who lived in British territory from the 18th century to 1947, but they are, in fact, amongst the most important as far as the British are concerned, because there was an entire commissioner, agent to the Governor General, who looked after the family of the Mughals, and there's copious correspondence, textual and in Urdu, in Farsi, and as well as in English. Now, but in my own work, in addition to the archival or the textual materials, I have also made a foray into visual materials, and also for me these sites are very important, and I'm going to be discovering some of them with you today. Now, these, as far as these the Baghs themselves are concerned, now the maqbara that you are seeing is that of Jahandar Shah or Jawan Bakht, and in fact, and of his descendants. Right. So, to what extent are the Baghts actually remembered as part of the public memory of Banaras? Because it's not as if the city of Banaras is lacking in public commemorations and memorials. In what most people would consider the main heart of Banaras, there are parks and public spaces that are named after notables, patrons, and donors who have contributed to Banarasi public life. But most of them are Hindu, and there are absolutely none that are named after the Mughals. The public debates about conservation and heritage that largely focus on the temples and ghats, though in fact this has received attention from a large number of excellent historians who have spoken about the need for us to think about Banaras as a city historically, not outside the purview of historical trajectory. So in other words, to not think of Banaras as a timeless city. So so I'm building on this work, and that includes my own. And I'm also moving away from the and pushing back against these sort of the polarizing debates in the public domain about the Mughals in Banaras and their connection to Banaras, which tends to be only focused around sort of these polarizing and unfortunate debates about the early modern mosques, whether it's Gyanvapi or whether it's it's the Dharara Masjid, etc., which are Alamgiri mosques. Now, these mosques are regarded as monuments, and they are under the Archaeological Survey of India, which is also very different from these buildings which are actually constructed and are associated with the later Mughals. Now, there will be two kinds of buildings that I will be showing you, and through which I will be trying to tell the history of the Mughals. One is sites that they were associated with, and the second is sites that they actually built and that are connected to the family. And so I'm going to be looking at this through three main themes. The first is to discuss where it all started, as it were, and to pick up the figure of Jahandar Shah, who you see in front of you. Now, this is a painting of Jahandar Shah that was probably taken by one of the painters accompanying Warren Hastings, the Governor General of India, with whom Jahandar Shah had a long and very extensive correspondence in Persian, and who he met when Warren Hastings came to Banaras, when Jahandar Shah was also there. And so there is a folio by Warren Hastings painter, and there are a series of pictures of paintings of Jahandar Shah. So, and this is one of them, and this is from the British Library. So, so I start by looking at Jahandar Shah himself, in placing him in political context and trying to understand what drew him to Banaras, right? And I will connect his history to that of 18th century Banaras, which I will sort of posit was an economic powerhouse. It was also sort of a very emerging political center, both for the Rajas of Banaras as well as the British. I'll be talking a little more about that. And interestingly, it was also a city of diplomacy and of intrigue. And it was a space where a large number of political pensioners, including Jahandar Shah, came to live. And So I'm going to be discussing, as I said, how through the eyes of the Mughal family and the descendants of Jahandar Shah, we can actually understand something about the relationship of the city, a city that transformed, that was open to a great deal of planning in the colonial period, as well as in the post-colonial period, and also to understand to what ways the Jahandar Shah's family as Banarasis, how their lives also were transformed by living in the city. So and through this, the larger project asks a lot of questions about selfhood and belonging and space making, and historical memory. But I will be engaging with only some of these questions with you. As I move to the second section and I talk about the colonial and post-colonial histories of the Mughal pensioners of Banaras and connect it to the sites that I'm studying, and specifically, I will look at Badshah Bagh, with which I have started, to think about the perils of selective forgetting and remembering and of heritage. So having said that, I'd like us to sort of, I want to begin by talking about tropes of Banaras, popular representations of Banaras, which are essentially that of a city of, a pilgrimage city. One that is a sacred city, one that is timeless, one that Diana Eck has called the city of light, which has almost put it out of historical scrutiny by historians, but which is changing now, and there is a very a small but extraordinarily rich body of work from which I'm taking my cues. Which looks at Banaras in a number of ways. It's looked at as a city of trade, which also becomes an important colonial economic city, a city of bankers, which also includes the monastic institutions that I was studying in my previous project. And it's also, there has been work that has pointed to the rich, the histories of weaving, and but by and large, I would say that the bulk of the work on Banaras has focused on its role as a Hindu pilgrimage city. There have been those who have spoken about the reconstruction of Banaras in the 19th century. This is really rich work, and have pointed out the fact that there were a lot of new sites that were constructed in Banaras, and in fact, there have been some who have suggested that the number of temples that, in fact, that were constructed in Banaras they went up exponentially in the 18th and 20th century. So a lot of what we consider old is not that old. But this also leaves out a large number of other sites, especially when we think about the large number of other kinds of buildings that were also expanding. And in fact, this was city of, if you like, this was a period when the city was being built and rebuilt, and there were a lot of other sites, spaces, and spatial complexes, which I'm also going to introduce to you, because in spite of its the colonial political economy, Benares, interestingly, retains in certain segments, it still was home to a large number of mercantile bankers, trading networks, and in fact, a lot of, shall we say, wealthy Indo-Persian families, many of whom were many of whom were political pensioners. Now, the reason I chose to work on the Mughals was twofold. One is, of course, amongst all the political pensioners, all of whom have built spaces and sites which I have not been able to discuss in this project, but which I think behoves a larger project, right? Points to, if you like, the many lost sites and spaces, lost not because they don't exist, but because they have not been acknowledged. But I focused on the what the records call the ex-royal family of Delhi Varanasi, also because the importance that they were given by the colonial state right until 1947, and the interest in the spaces and the sites that they lived in, and of course clearly the surveillance that they were put under for a number of reasons. And the other important thing, of course, is that the sort of engagement with Banaras that is polarizing, that completely undercuts the great deal of historical work that has been done for the early modern period, that shows the links between Banaras and the Mughal court in terms of imperial patronage, in terms of different forms of different forms of circulation of knowledge, of cultural transmissions, and of translations, and a whole heap of other things. And of course, apart from the fact that Banaras was not just a pilgrimage city in the early modern period, but it was also a very important political center, one that it continues to be even in the colonial period. So I'm going to be looking at this period particularly, and I'm also going to be this photograph for me was one that actually is also just like the previous one. It's a metaphor for the intertwining of Banaras's, shall we say, past and presence with that of the Mughals. And this, of course, is the Dharara Masjid, the Alamgiri Mosque. This is for me, my argument is that it is not one or the other. We have to understand that Banaras is a history of composite and very complex histories, and it is important to acknowledge them and to think about what this means for how we think of heritage, of tourism, and in terms of, and of course, as historical memory. So what I want to do is to start with with Jahandar Shah himself. Now, when Jahandar Shah comes to the city, he comes to a space that is not just full of. It's not just a pilgrimage site. As I said, it's one that is extraordinarily rich, which draws a large number of not just elites, but those who are either who are at loggerheads with the British, but who have banking houses and diplomats in Benares, or those who the East India Company is increasingly beginning to send to Benares as a space of, if you like, of house arrest, right, where they live as political pensioners of the British. So Benares is a city which has more than a whiff of political intrigue, but it is also a space which, in fact, is which had in the 18th century, and which continues to have, also because of not just the pensioners, but because the city itself, a rich Indo-Persianate culture. Right? And while most of the paintings and the photographs that we have of Banaras are also of the Ghats, there are also many of its masjids, its imambaras, its dargahs, and other really interesting buildings, not all of which are private monuments, but are also connected to a rich fabric of life, which is not a parallel life, but is very much intermeshed with mainstream Banarasi life. And it is to this city that Jahandar Shah is drawn. So just as to place this in historical context, to actually sort of to tell you about the entire to tell you about Jahandar Shah, before I go into details, I want to talk a little bit about Banaras itself. This map that you see in front of you is from a period which is slightly later from that of Jahandar Shah, but this is from 1822, and this is a map that is used and has been used not just by me, but other historians. It's the very famous map by James Prinsep of 1822, which focuses on Banaras, but it also, for me, it shows the expansion of the city of Banaras right from 1775, when the Zamindari of Banaras was one of the very powerful successor states, when the various subas and provinces and spaces that owed fealty to the Mughal court, in fact, were striking out on their own and striving for, and in fact, building their own nodes of power. And the Zamindari of Banaras is one of them. But the power of the Raja of Banaras comes to an end by 1775, when the East India Company, in fact, takes over the Zamindari of Banaras, and in fact, right from then on, Banaras is under the hold of the British, who start almost immediately establishing military contingents in the city. They establish their military cantonment in Sakhrol right from the 18th century, and also they place a huge military presence in the Chunar Fort in Mirzapur, which is actually 1 hour away from Banaras. It is at this point in time, Jahandar Shah has not yet come to Banaras, but he's active in Delhi. He is, by now, he is the crown prince, he's the Shahzada, he's active as a regent and representative of his father, but I will sort of talk about that a little more. But in 1781, the city sort of changes its face when the Raja of Banaras, Raja Chet Singh, whose palace is going to be important for our story, he rebels against the British, and therefore, and after which he is removed, and in his stead, another member of his family is made the Maharaja of Banaras, whose descendants continue to be known as the Rajas of Banaras even today. Now, but at this point in time, the city is already attracting attention and is famous because it is at the crossroads of trade, both within the area that we would know in the colonial period as British India, but also beyond. Right? But at this point, we're also seeing by the 1780s a large number of political prisoners, whether it is members of the Raja of Nepal, the Rohillas, the Marathas, and in fact, this number was only going to increase, right? So by the time Jahandar Shah arrives in Banaras, he's actually coming to a really interesting and cosmopolitan city. And one which is increasingly, and his descendants are going to add to the large number of political prisoners. And so they are the importance of political prisoners and Banaras as a space for political prisoners is something that has rarely been talked about. Sorry, not prisoners, but pensioners. So, as I said, from Rohilla nobles to ex-Nawabs of Awadh, and amongst many others, and of course the Mughals, right? And this was the company that Jahandar Shah jostled with in Banaras. And increasingly, after Jahandar Shah, when after his untimely death, when his descendants in fact remain in Banaras, they join the large number of political pensioners who are sent to the city by the East India Company, and many of whom were a thorn in the side of the company. Others, in fact, were sent to Banaras by princely states because they were seen as threats and as local local centers of power, and so therefore they were in fact they were sent to Banaras in complicity with the East India Company. And so this was a very interesting space. And as I said, there are all these families who came, they are associated with sites and spaces and so on. And one could actually write, if you like, an alternative history of the city, its architecture, its built forms, by looking at this particular history. But I'm going to try and tell you the story, or just talk about a little bit through the family of the Baghs. But the one thing that I do actually want to gesture towards, and which I can't talk about in great detail, is the fact that in this entire period, from the 1770s to 1947, Banaras was to actually change its face right? Because it becomes what you see in this map is sort of interesting because Jahandar Shah's family is allocated place to stay at the very edge of the map. And the city of Banaras at that point in time is focused along the Ghats. And in fact, the area that you see around you was fields and orchards and farms. And in fact, when Jahandar Shah comes in the 1780s, he is allocated space at the edge of the city, given the fact that he had a large army and they needed space for their tents, for hunting, and so on and so forth. And interestingly, the area that Kutluk Sultan Begum, his chief queen, is given in Badshah Bagh was then on the outskirts of the city, which of course looks very, very different today. So therefore, Banaras under colonial rule not only expands, but it is completely refurbished spatially, just like other colonial cities, including Bombay. It is because right from the 18th century, the East India Company start building cantonments, railway lines, and a different form of buildings. And so by the end of the 19th century, we have Banaras is very much of a colonial city, right? And it's planned as a colonial city. But what is also interestingly being done at the same time is to kind of reconstruct it as a pilgrimage center, and putting focus also, and the Archaeological Survey sort of plays a great role in this in its reports, both as a site that is of historical importance for its ancient Buddhist archaeological remains at Sarnath, and also because of its temples, right? And because of the Mughal of the Mughal masjids that are the early modern period. But updated lists do not include the kinds of sites that I am going to be talking about to you. So so therefore, before one actually talks about the sites and buildings that are connected to Jahandar Shah, I think I would like to talk a little bit about who he was. This again is another a painting of Jahandar Shah from around the 18th century, and we can posit and speculate that this is as a true likeness, because we do know that he met Warren Hastings, as I said, with whom he corresponded for about 6 or 7 years. He was the eldest son of Shah Alam II, the tenuous emperor who was at the mercy of various political stakeholders, including the Marathas, who was struggling for supremacy in the 18th century, in the period that historians have for a long period now called the period of the successor states. Born in 1749, he lived until 1788, where he died in Banaras at the age of 42. Jahandar Shah had a very eventful life because from the age of 20, he was a military commander, he was the crown prince, he was recognized as a Shahzada, and he was very often the intermediary between his father Shah Alam and those who were actually holding Shah Alam as hostage, as prisoner, and so and this included the Marathas and the other political stakeholders in the Maratha court, and with whom in the Mughal court and in the Maratha court, and Shah Alam was sort of moved from place to place. So Jahandar Shah, interestingly, he is present, and he is a very important figure in the Maratha correspondence, and as the representative of Shah Alam, as somebody who was a military commander in his own right, and who travels, in fact, in the 18th century from place to place. He not only is involved in a variety of battles, but by the 1780s, he is looking for armies for two reasons. One is to try and glean support for his father Shah Alam, and the second, he's also fighting his younger brother Akbar Shah. Mirza Akbar Shah, who in Delhi. And it is for these two reasons that he actually leaves Banaras, to look for funds, to look for more capacity for soldiers, and also for his own personal safety. So by 1784, he goes to Lucknow, where he stays for a while with the Nawab of Lucknow, and then and wherever he moves with his armies, his retainers, his court, and also his households and his families, which is very, very important. And by this point in time, he's also being given an allowance called a Peshkash by the Nawab of Awadh, which is mediated through the East India Company. And then, interestingly, he moves to Banaras because he's hopeful in meeting Warren Hastings, the Governor General, and he thinks of Banaras as a space from where he might meet him, if not in Calcutta, which is where he was proposing to go, because he wished to use to ask the East India Company for help. But Jahandar Shah, while he is in Banaras, he is a very we know that he's a very interesting figure, that he is that he spent a very short period of his life here, but it was meant to be a temporary stay. And he, in fact, envisioned himself going back to Delhi, but unfortunately, he dies in 1788. But while he was in Banaras, the moment he arrived, he was allocated the Raj Mahal, or the of Chet Singh, so which you can see with a glimpse of the interiors. And this was to be an important space, because the Chet Singh Palace, as it is known today in Banaras, is in Shiwala Ghat, which was at that time at the outskirts of Banaras, and that is how it is described in the residence proceedings in the 18th century of Jonathan Duncan, who advises Shahzada Jahandar Shah or Jawan Bakht that we are giving you this place to stay because it is further away from the city. There is enough space for you, your retainers, and your armies. And also there are spaces for hunting, which is suggestive that this was also at this point a space that was completely surrounded by, not by buildings, but by empty space, by forests, and so on. And so Jahandar Shah comes here, as I said, with all his households. And this is important because after him, his retainers and his armies would dissipate, but his households would stay here. And they were given space in the city. And what is important about the Raj Mahal is that after Jahandar Shah's death, in fact, his descendants, or a large number of descendants, would continue to live here until the early 20th century, when they were removed by the colonial state and the Raja of Banaras. And then they were forced to move elsewhere, but I'll come back to that a little later. But while Jahandar Shah is in Banaras, he lives here, and he makes forays to various places. He goes back to Delhi, he goes to Lucknow, and he also goes on a variety of visits for devotional purposes. And one of the places we know that he went to is the Dargah of Chunar, which is right across the river, and it's technically in Mirzapur, and it is very close to Banaras. And the Dargah of Chunar is a building that, and it's a Dargah whose Khalifa had a very tempestuous relationship, like many other Sufi walis, with the Mughal court in Delhi. But what we do know is that Jahandar Shah used to come and go between Banaras and the Dargah of Chunar, and as popular folklore and in fact oral histories have it, he died after returning from Chunar, and when he was sort of caught in a rain, and he developed high fever. But apart from the other reasons why he went to Chunar, we also know that one of his companions, and most probably his wife, Taj Begum, is actually interred in the Dargah of Chunar. And what I am showing you here is what is inferred to be the maqbara of Taj Begum in Chunar Dargah. And what is sort of really interesting is that even after the Jahandar Shah's death, right up till 1973, where we have accounts for the pensions of the Mughal families, that a certain amount is always sent annually every year to take care of the tomb at the Chunar Dargah, as well as to make other devotional offerings at the Dargah through the Wali. So this is a space that, as I said, which is connected by association with Jahandar Shah, but which comes into sharp relief, which is very important. Another one, of course, is the Dargah Fatman, which I'm going to be talking about again, but which, again, we know is by the 18th century a very prominent and Shia center in Banaras. It's very close to Badshah Bagh, and in fact, and it was, and this is a print from James Prinsep's a book on Banaras, and this is a picture of Muharram in Banaras in 1822 at the Dargah at Fatman, which is the Dargah Fatman, which is very, very close to the, in fact, it's right across the wall to the photograph that I showed you of Badshah Bagh. And what we also know is that a large number of members of Jahandar's own family and his retainers also went to the Dargah Fatman, because one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is how the Mughals and Mughal households were also both Shia as well as Sunni, right? So these are really important associations, really important buildings, and these are spaces that we know that Jahanabadi Begum, one of Jahandar Shah's wives, came. His sons, Ali Qadar, also went to Dargah Fatman, and and these associations continue well after Jahandar Shah's demise. Now, Jahandar Shah himself, after moving between Delhi and Banaras and Lucknow and so on, he dies of an untimely death at the age of 42. And this is when things change for the Mughals and the families, the households, and the retainers, and they have to actually decide whether they're going to stay or not. But what we do know is that a decision was made by the households of Jahandar Shah that for the most part they would not go back to Delhi because it was not considered safe. And so therefore they in fact continue to live in Banaras and not only establish roots in Banaras, but Jahandar Shah himself is buried in Banaras. And here again, I'm showing you the elevated pavilion in which Jahandar Shah is buried. There are descriptions that of the fact that his chief wife, whom the British regarded as the most important figure in the family, Nawab Kutluk Sultan Begum, commissioned the materials both from Chunar, which is very famous for its stonework, and in fact she commissioned the labor, and that this was that his maqbara was constructed in a space that was given to her in this place that we now know as Badshah Bagh, which was in 1816 referred to in records as Hyderabad Bagh. And at that time, the only thing that was there was Jahandar Shah's maqbara. There was a dargah, and but it was only later that all the other buildings, that this really fascinating complex, which comprised 20 acres, comes into being. But we do know that Hyderabad Bagh, by 1816, when Kutluk Sultan Begum is still alive and when this maqbara is completed, was 20 acres, right? And here this is at the bottom of this pavilion, which is where we see where Jahandar Shah was in fact interred. Very interesting in contrast to the other fabric at the presentation of the maqbaras, which are very ornate with calligraphy. This is very, very simple. And from what I have been told, I believe that Jahandar Shah is buried alongside not just Kutluk Sultan Begum, but his eldest son Khurram Bakht, who also lived in Banaras and about whom I will be talking in a moment. But this is it's sort of interesting, unlike all the other pavilions and all the other maqbaras, which are which are very easily accessible. Over here, what we see is just the opposite. We see it's almost hidden, and it took me, in fact, a number of on-site visits to actually find out where exactly Jahandar Shah was interred. And in fact, it was through members of Jahandar Shah's family. Many people who lived on site mistakenly pointed out one or the other graves, especially the one which was more ornate. But what is striking about this is that it is sort of there is the top of the pavilion has empty caskets, but right at the bottom are the actual graves. And as I said, I don't know enough about the site yet to know whether it was defaced, whether it was very elaborate and it was removed by grave robbers, or it was intentionally left plain. But these are the sort of this particular space, Hyderabad Bagh, which begins with this one simple elevated pavilion, in fact was to develop over the course of the 19th and the 20th centuries, and I'll be coming back to it when I talk about Badshah Bagh. But even as the intention of Hyderabad Bagh is that it was not just a Kabristan or graveyard, but in fact, it's, as I said, a complex structure of which graveyards were just one part. There were also pleasure gardens. There was a baradari or a pavilion. There were offices, there were residential spaces, and there were also pleasure gardens. There was a lake, and there was also, of course, a variety of offices and orchards. And so what I am going to come back to is how it comes to be in the sort of the state that it was in when I started doing my fieldwork, and of the photo which I gestured with at the beginning of my talk. So after the death of Jahandar Shah, then what is sort of really interesting and really important is that the family of Jahandar Shah, the families and the households of Jahandar Shah decide to stay in the city. They do not go back to Delhi. Some members go back and forth between Delhi and Banaras, but this actually comes to a stop after 1857, after the Great Rebellion, after the Mughal court is snuffed out. But interestingly, the fallout of 1857 does not really affect this particular family, right? And in fact, very few of them none of them are put in prison. And what is interesting is that they're treated with a great deal of courtesy right until 1947, as you can tell from the voluminous correspondence, as I said, that is largely is found in the archives of the district commissioner, who was also played a very important role. It was also doubled up as the agent of the Governor General. Who was in quote unquote who was surveying and taking care of the Mughal family. Now, after Jahandar Shah's demise, we see that not only does the family kind of stay in Banaras, but they construct a large number of sites, including the one that you see in front of you, which I'm going to come back to, which is the Choti Shahi Masjid in Shibala. An area which is just behind the Chet Singh Palace, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But after Jahandar Shah's death, the British start enumerating his official households, right? And what they actually do is to divide his households, interestingly, into terms that they could understand, but terms that were intrinsically they came from, particularly by the early 19th century, the vestiges of colonial law, which distinguished between legitimate and illegitimate households. And so therefore, or rather legitimate and illegitimate lines. So therefore, if we look at this list of households, and Jahandar Shah's the chief wife, or Nawab Kutluk Sultan Begum, and her son, her eldest son Mirza Khurram Bakht, was seen as as representative of the legitimate line of succession and of descendants of Jahandar Shah, and the others in the genealogies, which were kept by the agent to the Governor General to Banaras, who actually made a record of every single family born in Banaras who claimed to be Mughal. They were either connected to this legitimate branch, and Mirza Khurram Bakht and his families and children, or they were linked to the so-called illegitimate branches that emanated from Jahandar Shah's wife and companion Nawab Begum Jahanabadi Begum, and his son Mirza Haji, his other son Mirza Ali Qadar, as well as his other wives, companions, and children. So right from the 18th century, and this is something that historians who are interested in household and gender have pointed out, that like other pensioner families, Jahandar Shah's family also was calibrated by colonial law in ways that would have a lasting impact on the ways these families saw themselves and the way they parsed their genealogies and those whom they actually sort of connected to the Mughal line, and those who were not part of it, or those who were legitimate and those who didn't, because this had an impact on those who had access to the sites and spaces associated with the Mughals. And these were the rights that were recognized by the civil courts, right? And also in municipal records. So this understanding of his official households is quite important, as it would follow these families. And in fact, this is something that I also found when I went, in talking to families, when they show me their genealogies. What is very interesting is that these genealogies are more often than not the genealogies that have been refracted, imagined, and sort of in a sense emanated from colonial categories, right? And this understanding of genealogy. So we know that after Jahandar Shah's death, and again I'm looking at the at Princeps map from 1822, we know that by this time that there were a large number of pensioner residences. And you can see from this map that this area, which is also next to Shivala Ghat, which shows Chet Singh's palace and maybe the area behind, very clearly is marked out as the Shahzada's residence, even though of course this was after Jahandar Shah, and it was very clear that his family was living in this area, and the area behind this is called Badshah Ganj, right? And it is at this point in time that a variety of households are living cheek by jowl, and there are a number of other spaces, and I'm going to show that to you in a minute, in Princeps map that indicates that there were a large number of pensioners' estates in Banaras. And in fact, these were very often the elite families and circles within which Jahandar Shah's family used to move. We also know, again from Princeps map, and I'm showing you two details, that of the importance of and the significance of Fatiman Bagh and Haidari Bagh, which you can see in the corner. It says Fatiman. It also mentions the Dargah Fatiman. And these maps, this Princeps map, in fact, is almost the way in which this area is shown in revenue maps, in municipal maps, though of course these have different numbers. But if we look at the maps that are from the late 19th and of course in the early 20th century, we can see the beginning of the spread of the city, the real estate boom, even in the colonial period, also as the municipal government and the district administration begin to acquire land to construct government buildings, right? So but we also know that the Dargah Fatiman is also very important, and these are all spaces and sites that these Mughal families have shares and interests in, not Dargah Fatiman, but Haidari Bagh. And we can also see that this is an area that we can quite believe the descriptions, because we can see that this is not built area at all at this point in time. So Haidari Bagh at this point in time, even after Jahandar Shah, is 20 acres, and so we can can sort of imagine the lake, we can imagine the orchards and the land, the pleasure gardens that are described in all the records, whether they're British or otherwise. We also know that Jahandar Shah's family participated from the 18th and even in the 19th century and well beyond that in the robust public life of Banaras, its political life. And in fact, right from the 18th century, we know that his sons were involved in the rebellion by Wazir Ali, the ex-Nawab of Awadh, who was also a political prisoner, who in fact murdered Mr. Cherry, who was the resident of Lucknow in Banaras, and this was part of a rebellion in which Wazir Ali was supported by a large number of political pensioners and also zamindars, disaffected zamindars in the Banaras zamindari. And a lot of historians have written about this, but what for me was very interesting was the connections between the households of Jahandar Shah and Banarsi life, including public life at this point in time. Also, the Mughals are connected with other families. All these households, they also sort of, again, this is showing you another selection from Princep's map, which also shows the estate of Nawab Shamshuddaulah. And these are spaces and sites I have yet to look at. So otherwise I would show you, because the Imambara Durga Kund was quite well known, but I believe not much remains of it. This is something that I hope to see this summer. But so there are, as you can see, a large number of estates of pensioners, but we also have archival evidence of the interaction in different ways of the Mughals with these families. We also know that the Mughals, Mughal households were marrying not only in Delhi and Jaunpur and other cities, but they were also marrying within Banaras, and they were also intermarrying within pensioner families, right? Including the Nawabs of Shamshuddaulah. Right? The other thing that we also know is that many of these families, by the late 19th century, they can be seen as very heterogeneous. They were both Shia and Sunni, but also in class terms, there were those who were extraordinarily elite, and there were those who also were extremely poor, and they were pushed into artisanal crafts, particularly into silk weaving. But there were also those who were sort of rich, wealthy, and ashraf. And in fact, many and what is sort of remarkable, and this is something that I have found, is that one branch of the family, in fact, intermarries with that of Seth Narsingh Das, who is a mercantile, one of the rich mercantile bankers of Banaras, and who in the 19th century, in fact, he becomes he converts and he becomes a Shia Muslim, and his name is Ghulam Haider. We are just looking at his this is his maqbara in Karbala in Allahabad, but he marries someone possibly from one of the pensioner families. I have not been able to trace it down yet. It is possible that he married someone from the Nawab of Shamshuddaullah's family, whose estate I showed you in the previous slide. But what we do know is that his granddaughter Kulsum Begum, in fact, marries one of the members of the legitimate line of Jahandar Shah's family, called Feroz Bakht. And in fact, it says it's sort of interesting, therefore, that the sort of families in the Mughal families, they sort of also are marrying across different kinds of boundaries, right? So they're also marrying across religious boundaries. And this is a very interesting phenomenon, because this family is also very significant and remains significant in Banaras even today. Now, what happens to the descendants of Jahandar Shah by the early 20th century is that they live all over the city, but they're concentrated in Chet Singh Palace, and until 1912, when they're actually forced to leave because they're evicted. And then many of them move into the Shivala Mohalla, which is adjoining. And there we have evidence that, in fact, many members of this family lived here until 1947. The municipal records and registers and files for Shivala Mohalla indicate that a large number of houses were given, were owned by members of the family, that were given to rent. There were mortgages. There was litigation between all of them. But in fact, it also indicates the very complex economic differences in status amongst the descendants of the of Jahandar Shah. And so while there were many who by the early 20th century who became lawyers, professionals, they joined anjumans or societies, they became part of public life and joined the Congress, the Muslim League, and so on. There were others who were much more modest. They became, they worked in collectorates and in municipal offices, and yet there were others who, in fact, as I said, went into the silk weaving industry. But what is very important for us to know in Shivala Mohalla is that many members of this family were also very involved in the buildings that we see. And so what I'm showing you here is the two Shahi masjids in Shivala, and the one on your left is the Badi Shahi Masjid, and the one to your right is the Choti Shahi Masjid. They're both imperial masjids, and they're both private waqfs, and throughout the period they have always had committees from which comprising members of the family. But what is sort of also really interesting again is that the importance of the sites themselves, because the buildings themselves have constantly being rebuilt, and you can see that the Badi Masjid is actually being rebuilt. It was being built when I was there last, and this picture is from 2023. So this kind of goes to the really interesting engagement with these sites. They're lived sites, they're not monumentalized, but they're refurbished again and again. And so there are lots of, and the connections with these are very different from those which are sort of, in a sense, made into historical monuments. So, but in addition to the Badi and Choti Shahi Masjid in Shivala, there are a large number of Imam Badas and so on, and all of them, of course, are either owned jointly or they are owned by particular members of the family. So as I said, it's very clear that the Mughal families are also really, they are very heterogeneous in terms of their religious affiliations, in terms of their, some of them, and also in class terms, some of them were Ashraf and some of them are not. But these differences in status and class did have meaning, because it did mean that there were, in terms of their power, access to power, and in fact, the relationship with each other, these their fates and did also impact the way they accessed various sites, right? But another site that remains very important, and especially for those who were Mughals, who were Shia, was the Dargah Fatman, which was built by the 18th century. It was built in the 18th century, and in fact, apparently with patronage from Chet Singh, the Raja of Banaras. And this again is a site that is refurbished, it's rebuilt. The structure that we see today is not what we saw in the print that I showed you, but this is a very important site for patronage for many Mughal families, and in fact, many of them are also continue to be buried here. Now, I just want to also, before I move on to the very last part of my talk, to just also say, to point out that a part of my research project, which I'm not able to look at here, is the important role that these families played in the political life of Banaras in the 20th century. And I just want to point to Kamran Bakht, who you see here, who is from the family of Ghulam Haider and Feroz Bakht. And he was a very important political figure. He was also, he comes up in all the reconciliation committees that that were established after a series of communal riots in Banaras, particularly from the 30s, and particularly the riot of 1939. And he was also very active in a large number of anjumans and in organizing the Muharram, but and also in other facets of public life. And Kamran Bakht plays a very important role in the management committee of both of Fatman or Badshah Bagh, but he's also a very important member of what is called an important Anjuman, which in fact has branches in all cities, and also in Banaras, which is called the Anjuman for the ex-royal family of Delhi, in brackets Banaras. And what this Anjuman actually did was to keep a tabulation of all a genealogy of all the children that were born in Banaras and who claimed to be part of who claimed to be Jahandar Shah's descendants. And so this was a really important. It acted as a filter. And it examined the claims of those, and in fact looked at their genealogies, many of which, as I said, were being calibrated from the 18th century by the British. So Kamran Bakht, again, a man with many hats, an extremely important person, right until his death in the 50s. So what happens with this history? And this is, I sort of want to end, and I'm sorry if it's a little abrupt, but what happens to these rich histories? Because it does not end with Kamran Bakht. This family is, they're large, this family is still, there are many families which are linked to Jahandar Shah in various ways, who live in Banaras even today. And I have shown you a small selection of their sites, and I'm going to end with showing you Badshah Bagh. But to what extent are they at all remembered in the city? As I said, there are two kinds of sites. One is the sites that they are associated with, like Chet Singh Palace and the Raj Mahal and Dargah Fatman and so on, where and the Chunar Dargah, where we know there are links with them. But we also know, particularly with Chet Singh Palace, that this is where the family lived for over 100 years. And there are a second set of sites which are which are built by these families themselves. And I've shown you a small selection. But what we actually see, even in the public plaques, and this is the plaque on the Raj Mahal, that is on the Chet Singh Palace, which in fact is clearly a British plaque, which demarcates that this was the residence of Raja Chet Singh, and it actually sort of is a commemorative plaque, which is remembering those of the native troops and the two companies that were quote unquote massacred, right, by Chet Singh, and before his arrest by Warren Hastings. Now, interestingly, since then there's been a lot of this sort of updating of the public, if you like, a conversation in Banaras. There has been, and also for tourists. But what is sort of really interesting is a complete silence on the fact that this was a site and a space that was associated with the Mughals, right? With Jahandar Shah, who lived here, and of course his descendants also, who lived here till they were evicted in the early 20th century. There's absolutely no mention of that. So, in fact, studying and working on Jahandar Shah and his descendants has actually been very interesting, very challenging, because we also know from a lot of colonial records that, in fact, that there were families who lived inside this palace, right? And in fact, many, did not want to leave, and ultimately they moved into Shivala, which is this area that is continued. That is around this area, and then this palace is taken over again by the Raja of Banaras. So, but we do know, as I said at the beginning of the talk, of the fact that Banaras is a city of selective commemorations, and particularly with regard to the descendants of Jahandar Shah, who had such a big and I think a very important presence. And they had not just that, but they had sites and spaces that are associated with them. It is astonishing to me that, in fact, there is very little acknowledgement, and there's complete silence around them, except for, as I said, the kinds of conversations we have around the the masjids and the polarizing conversations around them. Now, the historical memories of those are also part of my project, but that's not something I'm going to be talking about today. But I do think that it's important to actually signal to that. But the part that where I want to end is with a consideration of Badshah Bagh, which I started with and which I wanted to end with, and where, because it is one of those spaces and sites which is actually where it is hard to miss the Baghs. And this is now today, it is in the middle of an urban sprawl in Banaras, very close to not just the cantonment, but also the civil court, the collectorate, the commissioner's office, and so on and so forth. But and so therefore, contemporary map of Banaras is very, very different from obviously Princeps maps or even the maps of 1883, when we know that the price of real estate was not so high that in fact the city had encroached, not encroached, but had spread to in fact completely surround and denude Hyderabad Bagh, as it's called. So this is the entry, the gate to Hyderabad Bagh, which was, as I had gestured earlier, was built by 1816, and subsequently it was developed. Those 20 acres were developed, and so this is a very complex spatial site, and in fact cannot just be seen as a qabristan or a graveyard, which is how it is. It may be viewed on first sight, because all the orchards, the baradari or the pavilion, the lake, and all the other residential buildings have all but disappeared, right? So from 1816 till 1889, what we know is that there was no formal trust, but this the Hyderabad Bagh, together with all the other sites, the houses, etc., they were managed individually by the families, but those that were supposed to belong to all all the descendants of Jahandar Shah, and this included Badshah Bagh, were managed by the Raisas. Now, the Raisas were, this was a figure that was created by the political agent to Banaras, where the responsibility for the pension and the incomes of Jahandar Shah's descendants was given to the women in the family, interestingly. But I think this was it was an intentional strategic move to completely marginalize the male members of the family. And so the first Raisa was Nawab Kutluk Sultan Begum, and each Raisa chose her own deputy. This led to tensions within her own within the family, and each Raisa also chose her own successor. But after 1889, the position of Raisa in fact is brought to an end, and this is replaced with a committee which in fact is established in 1889, and this is called the Fatman Bagh Committee. And the Fatman Bagh Committee works hand in hand with the Anjuman of the ex-royal family of Delhi Banaras, and so they work together. And what is sort of really interesting, that one of their primary tasks is the management of the pension and management of sites which in fact over which all of Jahandar Shah's descendants have rights and shares to. Right? So the Fatman Bagh Committee consists and comprises of the agent to the Governor General of Banaras, who is usually the Commissioner of Banaras, who had an office here in Badshah Bagh, within these precincts, which does not exist anymore. And it was responsible for the maintenance and regulation for the sites associated with this family, and also interestingly to make sure to look, not just take care of Badshah Bagh, but also to make sure that there was the allowance of the tomb allowance, as it was called in colonial records or in the records of the Fatman Bagh's accounts, was sent to Chunar every month, right? So this is. And interestingly, after 1947, even after the colonial state comes to an end, the government of Uttar Pradesh, in fact, continues to have a very important say in this, if you like, private trust, and it manages the Fatman Bagh Committee until 1973. And it is almost deemed a provincial, if you like, a site of importance, and so therefore it is taken care of. But after 1973, for reasons that are too complicated to explain here, the government of Uttar Pradesh decides that this is no longer a site It is no longer a public trust, but in fact it is private property, and it is to be returned to the hands of the family. And this opens, but the condition is that it will be returned to those who can show that they are Jahandar Shah's descendants. So this opens an entire legal hornet's nest, which I'm not going to go into here. But I just want to flag that well past 47, in fact, this is a site and a space where it is not quite a monument, but it is given great importance by the state government. And this is also the time, but through Badshah Bagh, through an examination of Badshah Bagh, you can also see how the shifts and changes of the urban scapes of Banaras itself are in fact contributing to the, if you like, the changes that we will see in Badshah Bagh. So we know that what you can see here, and what I could see right from when I came here, is that the remnants of the large number of maqbaras, which were all on raised pavilions, which you have to sort of imagine now, and but even before sort of I came, even when the area was under the Fatman Bagh committee, and also then the provincial government, the government of UP, we do know that there were people who lived on the site. Members of the family used to come and go, but also there used to be those who were attached to the family, and very often those who took care of particular maqbaras used to live on the site. But that was a very different kind of engagement from those who have moved in more recently. And we can see these, if you can see the houses in the background, you can actually see something else which is beginning to happen from the particularly in the post-colonial period, which is the boom in real estate, the expansion in cooperative societies, and also the expansion in different forms of housing, and some of which is not all of whom have sort of municipal numbers and so on and so forth. But what it has done, what we have is a space now where the Badshah Bagh, a large part of which has disappeared, but also we see a large number of graves have actually been have been destroyed, right? They've been demolished and they've been replaced by these houses. So what is in situ is what remains. And we can all, and I'll show you, and I'll be ending with a few other pictures. But so what we also know here is what has not been touched is the Shahi Masjid, which was built in the 19th century in Badshah Bagh. And this again is a masjid that has been refurbished again and again, and today it is separated from the rest of the site. There is a dargah next to it, but then it is separated from the rest of the site by a whole spate of other houses and buildings. And then inside the site there are a series of other kinds of factories, houses, and so on. But and right now the Shahi Masjid is under a private trust. And it has not been touched so far. It was again, this was the Shahi Masjid figures a lot in conversations about Fatman Bagh, its care, its upkeep, and so on and so forth. Now, the other thing that we know and we notice as soon as we go is that there's a lot of mention of the lakes and the pleasure gardens in Fatman, but we also know that in the colonial period and also in the post-colonial period, the municipality of Banaras was expanding and it was acquiring land. And a large part of the land that is acquired, particularly in the 50s, and we know that by the colonial period that that even in the colonial period, that a large part of the area that was a lake was actually dammed, and it became a municipal. This is a municipal tank, and so therefore that started sort of eating into the space, the 20 acres of Badshah Bagh. And after 47, there was a lot of acquisition that was made which added to the acquisitions that were made for to expand the entire cantonment area. But now there is there is a real estate boom, and the term cooperative societies is used. So they're right across from you, you see a colony in this photograph, which was actually part of the buildings or the boundaries of Hyderabad, Bagh, but it's no longer the case. And interestingly, now you can also see the many the art, which is now part of the public art that is commissioned by the municipality of Banaras, which is actually sort of linking Banaras's past and its present and its sites and spaces to a past that was, which actually kind of harks back to Banaras as a timeless Hindu site and space, without any reference whatsoever to obviously to Badshah Bagh and its own history, right? Its own Mughal history. But the other thing that we also see within Badshah Bagh, within the is these built colonies, right? So these are areas that were very often sold post 47 by members of the family who were poor, many who left Banaras for a variety of reasons. And so therefore we have this interesting situation where we don't quite know where the boundaries of Badshah Bagh actually end, because they're all blending. So in fact, if one was to do a study of Hyderabad in 1816 and the way it changed over the periods, you could actually plot the many facets of the urbanization of Banaras and the ways in which land becomes really important for private interests, for the district administration, for acquisition by the municipal corporation, and also, of course, by the and this is all escalated once the government of Uttar Pradesh sort of pulls out and the Fatman Bagh committee in fact collapses. Right now, this is an early picture that I took in 2010 of Badshah Bagh, where you can already see the foundations of some of these houses that were being built, but you could also see along the walls, you could see a lot of these pavilions, a lot of these graves with some calligraphy still there, but by and large you could see that there are still bits and pieces. But this is completely changed, and this is a picture that I took in 2023 or 2022, or 2023. But those pictures are very similar, where the built space has actually within the maqbara, the area where the maqbaras are, has completely taken over. In fact, many of the graves have been broken. Sometimes you see the remains of graves, as you can see in the background. And in fact, there are more houses than graves. In fact, so what we see is the destruction of a historical site, right? But what is sort of interesting and what is explained to me is that when I actually go on these site visits, is that an effort is being made to build the houses around the graves, right? So that they are not completely destroyed. But it's very, very clear that but perhaps the next time I go, that some of these may not exist. So, but I thought it's very, very important to chronicle what's happening. So over here now in Badshah Bagh, because of the, as I said, the rise in real estate, we also have when you walk in, where there are different ways in which people are actually engaging with these sites. There are those who have, as I said, who lived here and who actually have some connections with Jahandar Shah's descendants, but increasingly as newer families are coming in and they live in these new spaces and sites, often on the sites of graves that belong to the family that have been demolished, their connections to Badshah Bagh is very different. And they do not know, very often do not know who Jahandar Shah was, the significance of Badshah Bagh, and in fact, I'm invariably asked to speak to somebody who knows, right? But Badshah Bagh also has a large number of factories. It has it has car repair shops. There are all kinds of businesses that are in here, and so which are residing next to next to these Mughal sites. But interestingly, a large, as of now, many of the Mughal families still have shares and interests in these small, in Badshah Bagh, including over particular graves. Right. So, and very often there is litigation if, for example, an attempt is made to demolish one, and opposition and to oppose it, there are petitions filed in the civil court. Right. But so, in other words, so I just want to end by saying that Banaras is, and in the Banarasi Mughals have this very complex history, but one, as we can see, that is shaped, even if by looking at Badshah Bagh, by the creation of new forms of boundaries, new forms of urbanization, and also, as we can see now, the new differences and different kinds of inter-sectarian litigation. We earlier, this is what you see on the other side is the Dargah-e-Fatman, and where many of the descendants of the Mughals are still buried. But on this side now, we see there's an extraordinarily high boundary wall. Earlier, there was absolutely none. I think this is about 40 or 50 years old. But this also sort of is part of the different walls and the different, shall we say, tensions and conflicts that have come to characterize this space and site. And but when we talk about heritage, when we end, I would just like to think about the problematic of thinking about heritage in Banaras, because I think it's very important to push back against the sort of, shall we say, officials' understandings of heritage. This is a picture. This is a photograph that I took of one of the walls of the Kashi Vishwanath, new Kashi Vishwanath corridor, and you can see the remnants of old havelis that have been destroyed in order to build this. And so therefore, walking through this area, you can see many buildings like this. And in a context in which Banaras itself, where the idea of heritage itself is being reformulated, I think it's very important to actually write and chronicle and photograph the kinds of sites that I have been talking about, in order to actually think in very complex and very, I think, in different ways about the historical memories pertaining to a supposedly timeless city, and also one which is seen as purely as a sort of as a Hindu site, a Hindu pilgrimage city, but where my research points otherwise. Thank you.